Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. I do want to introduce our presenter today, Lillian Shapiro, President of HR 360.
Thank you very much, Frank, and welcome one and all. If you're still signing in, we're just going to do a little bit of an intro before we dig right into some very, very important information on how to conduct compliant interviews. So very important. Each and every business, large and small or medium-sized, at some point will be conducting interviews with candidates to fill positions, and you want to make sure, essentially, that you're doing the right thing. So, while every part of the hiring process is important, the interview stands out as a deciding moment for candidates and employers alike. In this webinar, you'll learn how to conduct effective and compliant interviews, what you should and should not ask, and how to use the information you gather to make smart hiring decisions. So let's move on to our first slide so we can begin the program. So we're going to be covering in today's webinar the entire interviewing process, how to prepare for an interview, how to conduct the interview, and then, of course, when it's all said and done, you've gathered all the information, evaluating candidates post-interview. So the whole point of this is that you want to get all the information that's relevant so that you can make the best possible decision when hiring for any type of position. So let's move on to our next slide, and we're going to be talking about an area that's extremely important, and that is staying with the law. And what do I mean by that? There are important legal issues surrounding the interview process, such as complying with the American with Disabilities Act, also known as ADA, and anti-discrimination laws. We'll provide examples of questions you cannot ask and should not ask in interviews, and offer acceptable alternatives that will elicit the answers you need. And finally, we'll discuss panel interviews, which can be an efficient way of vetting candidates. So our first area that we're going to be covering now is, as we move on to the next slide, is interview goals. And what do we mean by that? Your ultimate goal is to conduct fair and objective interviews. A great way to accomplish this goal is to ask the same questions to each candidate, allowing you to effectively compare the responses gathered at each interview to identify the best candidates for the job. And it's important to remember, the most valuable interview allows the interviewer to evaluate the knowledge, skills, and qualifications of a candidate. So what you're doing, just as a quick summary, during this whole process, your goals is, first and foremost, you want to collect information during this process that allows you to really objectively and decisively look at each person's qualifications, experience, and so forth, and does their experience actually conform to the requirements of the job? And by collecting this information and gathering it through the interview process, you're going to be able to answer all those questions, because at the end of the day, it's the knowledge, skills, and qualifications of the candidate that will always win the day. So the more information you have in those areas, the better that interview will go for you, as well as what's in the best interest of the company. So let's move on to our next slide. Now, in this next slide, we kind of go through, it's a nice little graphic, we go through the various phases or steps in the interview process, and I'm just going to take you through them so that you get the big picture. First, you want to select the interviewers. Now, typically in a smaller company, it's the hiring manager. If it's a larger company, HR might be involved also, or one of the owners of the company even might be involved in certain areas of the interviewing process. Really depends on the size of the company, but whoever's involved, you want to make sure all of the folks on that particular interview team, if you will, are ready to go and are knowledgeable on all the steps that they need to take. Second thing that you want to do is establish selection criteria. And we'll be talking, by the way, more about this in this presentation, but it's very important to think about what is it that you're looking for in that particular candidate, and it should relate to number 3, which is understanding the job description and requirements. Think of the job description as a roadmap. It's a blueprint to enable you to really understand, what do I want this candidate to do for me, for the company, for the job? And that is your blueprint and your outline. and really should be your guiding light in this process. And if, by the way, if you don't have a job description all set up for that particular position you're trying to fill, you definitely need to do one. That is a very important part of the process. And then you want to prepare your interview questions. Very, very important. And we'll talk about the do's and don'ts of related to interview questions again in this presentation. And the fifth step that we're going to be looking at right now is review and discard any inappropriate questions. So we're going to be talking about questions that you can ask that are compliant with federal and state laws generally, and questions you shouldn't be asking. And you'll be surprised at some of the areas that we're going to point out. Something that might look absolutely innocent and not a problem at all. We're going to, such as the concept of kind of small talk questions before you've even begun the interview process. Those are the kind of areas that we're going to be talking about that you should steer away from. But again, we're going to get into that a little bit later on. Number 6, ensure process complies with all laws. There are a number of laws, and we are going to get into them in a deeper fashion very shortly, but that's really what's so important here. It's a dual track. One, you want to make sure the candidate really fulfills in all the important ways the job description requirements or the requirements of the job. And of course, you want to be compliant with all federal and state laws. And number 7, conduct interview and take notes. So the key here is how to conduct the interview and taking notes and doing the things that you're supposed to do in order to make sure you've captured all the information you need from that particular interview. And of course, 8 is evaluate and compare candidates. So at that juncture, if you've interviewed a number of candidates and you've gone through this entire process, you want to be able to compare. And when you're done with that analysis and comparison of one candidate, all the candidates versus how they responded and so forth, you're going to be able, after that process is completed, to pick the best possible candidate. And number 9, notify candidates of the outcome, and we'll talk again more about what that means in terms of notification. And 10, conduct further interviews if necessary. And by the way, just a quick note on 9, it is always very, very important to be professional, courteous. So if somebody's interviewed, it's important to send a note back. If they have not made the cut, they're not going to be going any further in the interview process. That is the right thing to do. So sometimes folks get busy or it just goes to the back burner, but they've spent their time and effort to come and do the best they could during that interview. It is the right thing to do to send back a professionally written, nice, pleasant note back to them to explain the decision. So let's move on to our next slide, and we're going to be talking about what's happening as far as who are the interviewers. So you've got your hiring manager, as mentioned, HR professional, or other senior member of the team. So you really want to make sure you have put together that entire team before the process starts. If you've got one person starting with the first interview and then a couple of other people on the second interview, or it's whatever protocol that you have, everybody should know what the plan is. Everybody should have the job description, and all requirements should be absolutely across the board be understood by all members of the hiring team. Now, the team approach, which is preferably 2 to 3 members, the reason we think it's a very good idea to do this is it saves time and allows team members to compare impressions. So if you've got a team together that's basically going, let's say you've got a 2-interview process, first interview, then second interview, the team has put together their notes, their impressions, and then everything gets compared afterwards. If one person attends one interview and another person attends another, that could work out fine, but the feelings could be different depending on what stage they entered the interview process. So ideally, it's nice if the team can stay together and go through the process and then compare notes. So let's continue on. Now, what we're going to talk about here is selection criteria, appropriate to job complexity and level. So, let's say you've got a job description, right? And let's say it's for a junior software developer. And so you want to make sure that the requirements that you're putting into that software development job description don't also apply across the board to a senior developer, because if there's no difference, then it gets confusing. So there might be differences in the number of years of experience that you want to completely identify, or certain areas that a senior developer may have more experience in a certain aspect of the development, let's say architecting or other types of more skilled areas. So whatever the job description is, make sure it's specifically tied to that level that you're looking for, or the complexity that you're looking for. It shouldn't be kind of a one-size-fits-all, except that you're replacing junior versus senior and just a couple of years difference. Really think about what are the requirements of that level versus a more sophisticated level and a more senior level. So focus on factors that can be demonstrated in the selection procedure. What are those? Performance during interview, how did they do? Relevant training, education/training, experience. Now, when you're looking at this entire big picture of factors, what you want to be thinking about is, okay, they've given me all the information, but does it fit into the organizational or departmental goals? Does it fit into what we're trying to accomplish in that department or as a company? So it's, on the one hand, it's objective types of information, but it can be nuanced in terms of if there's training involved, or that the person, let's say they got a certification in one area, is it an area that's relevant to the particular type of activity that you're, or job description that you're looking for? So there's lots of different types of training that a person can go through, but does it tie right into, does it directly connect to the goals and what the department or company is trying to achieve? So there is a little bit more analysis in this, but it's always important to always think about the big picture, about what is in the best interest of the company. So let's move on. Thanks. Now we're going to talk about job descriptions and requirements. So you want to so what are we doing here? Familiarizing the interviewers with the job description and requirements, including major duties and responsibilities of the position, essential knowledge, skills, and behaviors necessary to perform the job. Each interviewer should review the job description carefully. And I can't emphasize enough how important this is, because sometimes folks who enter into the whole interviewing process might have a general idea of what the job entails, or a number of requirements, but not a complete picture. The more complete that job description is and the requirements are clearly identified, the better folks are going to be who are doing the interviews, as far as just pinpointing, are we getting what we need? Is the company getting what we need as it relates to this particular job description? So the more detailed that you have for all the interviewers in terms of what's involved, specific responsibilities, all of it, the better that entire interview process will go. If it's kind of loose and general and not as specific, then you're not going to have the right information to really drill down and make sure that that candidate is the right one for the job. So let's continue on. Thanks, Frank. So let's talk about drafting interview questions. So what do we mean by that? So essentially, your best bet is to start with the job description, where the listing of the position's requirements and responsibilities will give you a strong idea of what types of questions to ask. When writing your interview questions, avoid nice-to-know questions. In other words, questions that generate information that is irrelevant to the candidate's qualifications or ability to perform the job. In fact, rejecting an applicant based on information learned from an irrelevant interview question, depending on the information learned, may leave you open to a lawsuit. If applicants offer extraneous information during the interview, disregard these statements and don't write them down. So what do we mean by that? And we'll talk about it a little bit more later on. And that is that you want to stick with absolutely job-related questions. When you start, and I mentioned this before, a little bit about before the interview begins, and you want to warm up the kind of rapport, you might ask about where somebody conceivably comes from or family. Don't do it. Don't ask questions that are irrelevant to the needs of the job, because somehow or another, There could be questions that come up personally about family, which should not be asked. There could be questions that come up regarding location, if they're too far. Well, let's put it this way. Any type of small talk question that you think might be very innocent can have a flip side to it. So really the overriding concept here is, please, if at all possible, try to stick to information and questions related to the position. You can never go wrong. Seriously, you can never go wrong. So if you're wondering what kind of small talk questions could be fine or could not be fine, I guess if you just generally ask about the weather, you're safe. But it just tends to get into areas when you enter that arena of small talk to areas that you don't want to be in. So that's why we're very, very emphatic about sticking to job-related questions. So let's continue on. More information about the interview questions. Safest course is to stick to the script. During an interview, by using the same set of standard questions for every applicant, it's just your safest bet. This practice is the most reliable way to be sure that you're accurately assessing and evaluating your candidate's knowledge, skills, and qualifications. So just as a summary, you want to make sure your questions are structured and standardized. You want to make sure the questions and treatment of all candidates is the same. You don't want to basically weight certain questions to one candidate or ask less questions or different questions than another. This way, when you do these standardized questions, you're leveling the playing field. Everybody gets equal treatment, and that's what you want. Now, interview question builders are helpful. If you have access to the HR 360 HR library, there is an interactive, in the HR apps and tools section, there is an interview question builder that's extremely helpful. But if you don't have that, there are lots of downloadable types of forms for interviewing in the forms section. But the bottom line is that there should be something, either whether it's generated by a online or interactive tool, or you've got a pre-formatted form that helps you through this process. It should all be done in a structured, organized way, well in advance, so you've had a chance to understand the questions, tweak them if you want, but it's all done in advance of the interview and organized. So let's continue on. So just very quickly, in the interactive interview question builder, what you'll have there, if you use that system, is 400 scripted interview questions among a wide range of performance and skill categories, including analytical thinking, interpersonal skills, leadership, problem solving, teamwork. So there's all kinds of questions that could potentially be applied. Of course, the choice is up to the user, in doing this entire build out of questions. But it's important to remember that when it's all said and done, you want to be prepared with the right questions and questions that conform to your particular company's needs. Very much important to plan in advance and get those questions down. So let's continue on. So now we're going to be talking about complying with anti-discrimination laws. Now, it's very important to understand what these laws are all about in order for the interviewer and the folks preparing the interview questions. You want to make sure that no lines are crossed and there are no breaches as it relates to the anti-discrimination laws, because once that happens, that's a lot of exposure potentially for the company. So at all points during the planning and development of the questions and the entire interview process, it's very important to make sure that that interview is compliant and that everybody understands what the anti-discrimination laws are about and avoids at all costs any type of question that could lean in any way, shape, or form to a category which would be called discriminatory. So we want to make sure we know a lot about that. So let's continue on. What are the major federal anti-discrimination laws? Well, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and this applies to 15 plus employees, 15 or more, prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, including pregnancy, national origin. This is so fundamental and such a important law to understand and make sure that none of the questions in any way, shape, or form, whether they're prepared in advance or during the course of the live interview, at any way, shape, or form, touch on anything that could be discriminatory in the areas that I just described. So I can't emphasize it enough. So please remember when you're going to go through that interview process. Let's continue on. So there are more. Yes, there are more laws and there are more areas that I want to focus all our folks today on that are important. Equal Pay Act. No minimum number of employees. So equal pay is a very, very important thing to remember and important to keep in mind as you're developing the questions. And as far as the Equal Pay Act is concerned, it requires that men and women in the same place or same workplace be given equal pay for equal work. Makes sense? Of course it does. But does it happen? That's the job of the company and, of course, all the folks involved in the interview process. Age Discrimination and Employment Act. This is for 20 or more employees. Protects individuals 40 years of age and older. Protected class. Another protected class is Americans with Disabilities Act. This is for 15 or more employees. What are we talking about here? Prohibits discrimination against qualified individuals with disabilities. And what the employer needs to do in the case of a person who has disabilities is to make reasonable accommodations for employees or job applicants with disabilities, unless doing so would cause undue hardship. So reasonable accommodations, just for an example, might be that there's a wheelchair ramp to get into the building in order to conduct the interview. Or if the person is wheelchair bound, for instance, can they do a job being with a disability that they have? For instance, like a receptionist position. Okay, you know, there are absolutely ways to accommodate to make sure that that particular person has the ability to perform the job. But what's key to remember here is the following, that if it causes, for the particular job open, if it causes an undue amount of hardship for the employer, that might be a different scenario, meaning if the employer is going to, the functions of the job cannot be performed, the employer will end up potentially losing money or there could be issues. That is a gray area that has to be carefully monitored. I would say if there's any question related to what the definition of undue hardship is, and it will be different from job to job as it relates to a person with disabilities, I would say consult an employment law attorney or a professional in that area, because then you might want to really get some professional and expert feedback in that particular area. So let's continue on. Now, are we done as far as all the laws that you got to kind of watch out for and be careful to comply with? There are more. Additional federal and state laws protect veterans, pregnant women, and legal immigrants. It's very, very important. As I've been talking about federal laws up until now, states many times pass their own laws, and as it relates to discrimination and so forth, and or as you see right now on the slide, veterans, legal immigrants, and so forth. It's important to check your state laws. So anything related to anti-discrimination, it's both federal, which is some of the laws we talked about today, and you'll have to check state as well, because both have to be complied with. So really, local laws may also bar discrimination, as mentioned, and really what this means is some research and making sure that you're on track to comply with both sides of the fence, federal and state. And remember, lawsuits can lead to fines, penalties, legal fees, and costly settlements. So what you want to do at all costs, always, is to make sure during that interview process, you crafted your questions in order to comply with federal and state anti-discrimination law requirements and so forth. That's really what this is about, all law requirements, making sure that, what do we have? A compliant interview. That is the purpose of this presentation today. And if there's anything that you're going to take away, is to make sure that those laws are complied with, and then you're golden. Then you've done the right thing. So let's continue on. Now we're going to go through types of questions to avoid, and then a little bit later on, alternative ways of asking a question. So always avoid questions about race, ethnicity, gender, including pregnancy, plans to have children, and marital status, age, anything along those lines. Even like I said, it might sneak into a small talk question at the opening about family and number of kids that you might have. Please stay away. Stay away from anything related to family, gender, all the areas covered here, and age. You're always safest. Again, what do we want to do? Always go back to the job description, the requirements of the job. You're always safe sticking to that, and it's going to give you the best information about whether that person that candidate is the right person for the job, because you'll have it all detailed based on your job description and how they compare to their experience compares to what you're seeking in that particular job. So let's continue on. More information that you want to steer clear of, or questions you want to steer clear of: citizenship or national origin, arrest or conviction records, financial status. And let me tell you something, arrest or conviction records, many states have their own special requirements in this area. So again, it's very important when you tick down this list, whatever state you're in, you must check arrest or conviction records. If you have the HR library, you can go right into your state laws and it's right there for you. Easy. But if you don't have it, the other thing you can do is go to the state's particular website, and usually most states have nice, robust websites. Use the search function and look for the particular areas that have been mentioned in this presentation. So let's continue on. Marital and family status, same thing. More stuff we have to avoid. Discharge from the military, absolutely avoid it. Religion. I think everybody gets the gist here that any question that touches anything that could be construed as discriminatory as it relates to all of these, you just steer clear from. Just continuing on. So let's talk a little bit about ADA compliance, and that's American with Disabilities Act. You want to avoid questions regarding sick leave and medical conditions. Absolutely avoid them. And the actual disability that is that particular candidate might be experiencing. You don't want direct questions about these two areas. Just avoid it. Continuing on. So additional questions that are prohibited during the interview process as it relates to the ADA compliant interview. And by the way, when we say ADA compliant interview, it means all interviews. I mean, whether or not you discern a disability or you don't, these are just questions that you generally want to steer clear of. So although it's an ADA compliant interview, it applies to quote unquote a compliant interview. So here we go. Do you have a heart condition? Do you have a disability which would interfere with your ability to perform the job? How many days were you sick last year? Have you ever filed for workers' compensation? Have you ever been treated for mental health problems? What prescription drugs are you currently taking? Again, as you can see intuitively, I'm sure as you're looking at these are questions you should not ask under any circumstances. Now, I know some of them might seem a little innocuous or kind of innocent to you on some level, but they are absolutely prohibited, and don't even get near that area at all if you can avoid it. Again, how do we do that? We go back and stick with the job description and the requirements. It leads you right to the path of compliance. So let's continue on. Now let's talk about questions. This is for marital status, but it's a question that you want to avoid. And then how can you ask the question in a more compliant fashion? So instead of saying, are you married, what's your maiden name, you might ask, have you ever been known by or gone by a different name? So you're not actually asking about a maiden name or marriage or anything else, but you're asking something that is in the zone or area of compliance. Continuing on. Citizenship question alternatives. Questions that you don't want to ask. Where were you born? Where were your parents born? How long has your family been in the United States? What you really want to do is say a very simple question. Are you legally authorized to work in the U.S., in the United States? It's compliant to do it that way. Don't ask the first bunch of questions. Again, you're now stepping into areas that could potentially be construed in some fashion as discriminatory. So you want to ask something, but you want to ask it the right way. Continue on. And by the way, everybody attending the program today will receive a copy of the slide presentation that you're looking at today, and hopefully everything works out, a recording of the webinar as well. So I know this is a lot to absorb, and there's so many important areas here, so I know you want to refer back to this and hopefully forward it around to all your hiring managers to make sure everybody's doing the right thing. So what do you want to avoid as the interviewer? What is your native language? Where did you learn to speak Chinese? These are the type of questions you want to avoid. How can you ask something generally in this area? Are you fluent in, or can you work in other languages if there is a need in this job? So it's a different way of asking that definitely is in the more compliant zone. So let's continue on. Age questions. Here's another one. Here's something you want to avoid. Hey, I went to high school in Norwalk too. What year did you graduate? When were you born? Sounds like interesting small talk questions. Remember that whole thing? Steer clear. What can you ask? How many years of experience do you have in sales? So again, you notice we've gone to the job description point of view. Always safe. But once you get into the personal zone, you really do not want to go there. Always stick with, again, job-related responsibilities, requirements, etc. So let's continue on. Financial status questions. Here's another one. How long have you been at your current address? Do you own, rent, or live with relatives? You don't want to go into that area at all. What can you ask? What is your current address and phone number? Do you have an alternative address or phone number where you can be reached? So you're asking a certain aspect of this, but not in the way that's described in the first area, which is areas that you should not be talking about directly. So again, there's a way to do this that's compliant. And that's really what you have to focus on. And of course, avoid at all costs all interviewers asking the wrong questions. Let's continue on. Religion question alternatives. Here's a couple that you don't want to do. We close early on Christmas Eve. Do you celebrate Christmas? Or when you need time off for the Jewish holidays? You do not want to get into a person's personal religious practice and so forth. What you can ask is, working overtime can sometimes be required. Are you available on weekends or holidays? So basically, you have a way of asking a certain aspect as it relates to the job. You notice how it keeps circling back to that. The minute you get off into an area that is not relevant to the job, that's when people stumble and start to get into trouble. So you really want to make sure, again, as always, that it is job description or requirement related. Let's continue on. Family status questions. Here's a couple, again, that you want to avoid. You may need to put in short notice, overtime, or travel. Will this cause babysitting problems? How are your childcare arrangements set up? Nope, don't ask these questions. What can you say? Will you be able to meet the requirements of short notice, overtime, or travel when needed? So you're going to get good information. It's asking it in a compliant, alternative way. Continuing on, crime history questions. And let me tell you something. Many states have covered this in their arrest and conviction laws. So you want to really be sure about what your particular state has as far as legal requirements in this area. So questions to avoid. Have you ever been arrested or spent a night in jail? Have you ever been caught driving drunk? You just don't want to go there. It can absolutely violate state and local laws. And the bottom line is knowledge is where this is at. What do I mean by knowledge? Check the state laws on arrests and convictions, and you will get your absolute guidance on how to answer or how to ask these questions or what not to ask. But this is not the kind of thing that you want to be asking. Let's continue on. Disability-related questions. Things you should not ask. Are you able to use your legs at all? Does this cause you to miss work? Now, this is a very important point to make. The recommendation here is, of course, can you perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodation? That is the appropriate type of question. But what's important to note here is you have to ask that question of all applicants, not just the ones where there's a perceived disability. Everybody has to be treated equally. So this question should be included for all candidates. That way, there's no appearance of, well, certain people with disabilities get a certain kind of question and the rest don't. Everybody gets treated equally. That's always a safe route to take. It's the best route to take. And so this is the way you ask the question, and then, of course, you ask it of all applicants. Let's continue on. Now, there are ADA considerations for the interview. So first and foremost, it's unlawful to discriminate against a qualified applicant with a disability. I think pretty much all of us understand that already. This applies to employers with 15 or more employees. The next two bullets are extremely important. I can't emphasize it enough. Disability-related questions and medical examinations not allowed at the pre-employment offer stage. Don't ask these kinds of questions before employment at all, whether the ones we just talked about a little bit earlier on, and also questions related to medical examinations. An interviewer may ask applicant how he or she would perform essential functions. So again, it's kind of repeating what we said before, but it's worth mentioning again that you really want to make sure that when you're dealing with somebody who has disabilities, what is the essence of what you're looking for? Can that person perform the essential functions? That's A. And can they do them with a bit of reasonable accommodation from the employer? That's really what this is all about. Can they do the job the way you want them to do the job, the way the job description is required, and with a little bit of extra accommodation, can they do a fantastic job? That's really what this is about, and very, very important to do. If you want to read more about the ADA compliant interview and so forth, again, there's a whole big section in your HR library. You can absolutely go to the DOL website, Department of Labor website, because there's lots of great ADA related stuff. You just put it in the search window. There's tremendous amounts of great information out there on the ADA compliant interview if you want to know more. But it is so important. You want to just get it right. And the way you get it right is to make sure that you ask the appropriate questions and you do the right thing. So let's continue on. What questions should you never ask? Do you have AIDS or any other infectious disease? Are you gay? What is your race? What color is your hair? Have you ever brought a lawsuit against an employer? Have you ever been sexually harassed? How much do you weigh? Again, I know many folks out there are saying, oh gosh, I would never ask questions like that. But the reason why this is here and that we're talking about it is that sometimes something pops out of an interviewer's mouth and it borders on some area related to the questions I've just noted in this slide. And so what is our purpose here in going through this whole process with you? We want to raise consciousness of all of these areas so that it isn't just, well, you hope everybody has common sense and, you know, ask the right things and certainly doesn't ask the wrong things, but knowledge is power. If you know what is absolutely wrong, what is absolutely inappropriate, and what not to do, every interviewer should know this and clearly understand it. It should be in the psyche of each interviewer going through this process. Here are the questions I should ask, and I have to be careful because of anti-discrimination laws and all the areas that I've been told about to not go into the areas of personal questions or any of the other types of questions we've noted today. So let's move on. So we're going to talk briefly about the interview. Now, there's lots of different interview strategies. You want to use one that's appropriate to the position and skill requirements, and we'll just move on to the next slide, and we'll just talk a little bit about some of these. Create a comfortable environment, neat and quiet area. You want to make sure people aren't picking up a phone, looking at their email. It's disrespectful, frankly speaking. You want to make sure the focus is on the candidate, that there's a complete attention focused by both the employer, the interviewer, and the candidate on the questions at hand, and so forth. You know, it's nice to be gracious, offer a beverage. All of that creates a nice, comfortable environment. So let's move on. Demeanor. Be friendly. Put the candidate at ease. But what do I mean by that? Nice to be pleasant. Say hello. Welcome them. Don't engage in the small talk. I've been saying it as a theme all the way through. That is where the spillover goes into the possibility of discriminatory questions. So again, nice to be pleasant, a warm welcome and greeting, and then you get into the business at hand of asking questions that are relevant to the job description. Let's move on. Thank you. Interviewing suggestions. Nonverbal communication, active listening skills are important. Be prepared to answer questions about the job itself, and your company. So it's very important to not just tick through the questions. You've got everything prepared and you've got all the questions laid out. But then sometimes folks get so intent on answering the questions, they're not actively listening to what is being said. And so you really have to not only obviously get the right question out there, but sit back and really listen to the answer, take some notes, because if certain key points are mentioned or not mentioned, you want to make sure that those are recorded in some kind of written fashion so you can refer back to them, especially if you're interviewing a bunch of candidates. That's important. And you want to be prepared to answer questions about the job and your company. In fact, generally, this is my own personal feeling. I always want to see a candidate that asks about the job, you know, more detail, even asks about the company, or if they took the time to actually learn about the company in advance. That is also a good reflection of that candidate. So all of those areas are not quite the interview itself in terms of questions, but areas you should be looking for to see how that candidate does. So let's continue on. So how do you end the interview? You offer candidates a chance to ask any additional questions. And by the way, as I mentioned, if a candidate has absolutely no questions, I always kind of check that out, because you really want an engaged candidate if possible. That always makes a difference. So it'll be interesting when you record whether or not there were questions. Provide a general time frame for follow-up. You want to thank the candidate for his or her interest and time. And by the way, as mentioned before, a thank you note is always a gracious and professional thing to do. It's telling the candidate one way or the other if there are next steps or if the interview process basically has ended with the first interview. So let's continue on. You want to document the entire interview process. You want to document the whole evaluation of it, you know, what the purpose is and what's involved in the entire process from beginning to end, meaning that you cull together all of the information. Now what do you do with it? And you also want to make sure you protect against any potential charge of discrimination. So by documentation, and there are clear notes, clear questions, and everything has been, as we have mentioned, in compliance, and you've got a hard copy or electronic copy of that documentation, that makes a big difference. In case any potential charge is brought and you've got everything all laid out and documented, that's the best protection for the company. If everything's verbal and nothing is documented, nothing's in writing, that leaves more exposure to the company. So let's continue on. Making casual statements. Avoid statements that imply a promise or contract. Now, folks do this more than you might. It's actually fairly common to say things like, I see you have a bright future here. You know, you fit right in. Sky's the limit. We see a great future in growing with the company. Or if you're doing a good job, we expect you to be with us for years. There is an implicit promise in there. So you have to be very, very careful about not saying stuff like that, really. And it would even extend to, I would venture into doing performance reviews. You just have to make sure that you're not making a commitment to the employee. The employee can then say, wait a minute, you said I was going to be here for years. That's what you said. And then, and so on and so forth. And so you don't want to ever go there. So you don't want to make general overreaching statements like that. You want to avoid those. So let's continue on. So we're going to talk about panel interviews and what that means. 2 or more interviewers simultaneously. Remember we talked about that at the beginning, 2 to 3 people. That's very, very important. Now, it can include prospective team members. And so again, it's what we talked about. Whether it's a team member, the hiring manager, it could be somebody more at the top if it's a smaller company, but whatever it is in terms of the panel interview, everybody should have their own particular knowledge base of the questions and their role, taking notes, what you're looking for from the team. There should be an organized process so when everybody comes together, you'll have an effective way to get everybody's impressions and information to make the best possible hiring decision. So let's continue on. Now, what are some of the considerations for a panel interview? You want to determine the format and whether or not the people involved are actively asking questions, who's doing what, who's playing which role. Sometimes a person might be there to mention a few things and just be there for observing. But whatever it is, everybody should have their role defined. You want to share the interview questions and determine who will ask which question, of course. Inform interviewers of all off-limit questions. As mentioned, it's just prepping everybody with all the things you've learned today. Secure an appropriate setting that lends itself to a panel interview. And, of course, this is very important, allow sufficient time to debrief and evaluate the candidate. So what you want to do is bring everybody back together with their own notes and their own impressions, and then really put it all together for each candidate. Just put all of the feedback together so that you can compare one candidate to the other, look at all the different documentation and impressions, and then when you've gotten all the notes and everything and you've analyzed everything, then that's the best possible way to make the hiring decision. Let's continue on, thanks. Now, how do we evaluate a candidate? First, you want to create criteria when developing the interview questions. So you want to basically identify what you're looking for, both in those questions and in the candidate, whoever that may be. And what you want to make sure about is, again, are they fulfilling the needs of the job? And all of those will have been identified in the job description. You want to set up a formula to rate or rank responses. Importantly, and we've said it before, but it's worth saying again, ask all candidates the same questions. And then you want to complete the evaluation forms immediately after the interview. Why? Because you know what happens. You get real busy, you jump back into the job at hand, interview's done, and you say to yourself, hey, I'll circle back, get to this by the end of the day today or tomorrow, and things happen. And then the memory gets a little bit duller. You know, you kind of forget a few things, and things aren't as crisp and clear as right after the interview, immediately post-interview. That is the best way to get all of this evaluation together, so that really what you're doing is you've taken the time and effort to do all the right things, all the compliant questions. Let's get the information together. Let's make sure it's documented post-interview so that the best possible decision could be made for hiring. So let's continue on. So let's talk about criteria-based ratings. So there are forms out there. Again, there's downloadable ones from your HR library for interviewing that ask the interviewer for notes, rankings, and recommendations. Obviously, what we're asking folks out there is to pick one that actually works for your particular company. And again, there are customizable, downloadable forms from your HR library. But again, you really have to think about your company, the position. It could be, candidate's presentation, education, work history, and so forth. But they do have criteria in there. So it's important not to reinvent the wheel and to, potentially you take advantage of some of these forms. Let's continue on. And so in this type of appraisal, you're assessing qualifications in a scale of exceeds, meets, or does not meet requirements. So it's a different type of appraisal. And so again, it's a form that's set up that potentially can be used so that you have different types of criteria as mentioned, whether it's exceeding requirements, meeting or not meeting requirements, or not applicable to those. Whatever those requirements are, you list them, and then you have, again, the chart lined up so that checkoffs can be done depending on where that candidate landed for a particular area, for instance, let's say essential job functions and so forth. So you just want to make sure, again, that you have a form or some type of appraisal documented method that allows everybody to pool their impressions and how they feel that particular candidate did as it relates to all these different areas like job function and so forth, and then get that documented so that you can evaluate and then decide. So let's continue on. Now, a manager's appraisal is a little bit different. This is completed by the hiring manager, and why? It's due to the hiring manager's in-depth knowledge of the position. So unlike some of the other folks that might be on the panel, that might be on the interviewing team, the hiring manager has a very strong sense, in addition to the job description, and that hiring manager may have played probably a very significant role in developing the job description. They live it and work that job every single day. They know what they're looking for. Yes, the job description will give a lot of guidelines, but they're going to have their own point of view, and well, they should, because they're so deeply involved in that, if they're the hiring manager for that particular position, if they're the supervisor or manager of that position, that is really a critical area to capture, because they're going to know things that somebody in HR or just somebody that's maybe on the team who attended the interview, or somebody way up, could be a partner or owner or CFO or somebody higher up, not exactly the hands-on folks who actually manage for that particular job function. So that opinion should be respected and should be evaluated very carefully, which is why managers can also have their own appraisal form, and well worth capturing. Let's continue on. And let's just talk quickly, because we're closing up now, about follow-up. So obviously, what are next steps? Invite successful candidates for more interviews, or make an offer, or quickly inform candidates who aren't being considered. Again, what are we saying here is, let's be professional. If there's a next step, let's clearly define what it is, or steps, I should say. And if the person will not be continuing on the interview process, let's be professional and courteous and gracious, and send a professionally developed note, that email that basically says that they're not going to be continuing on the process, in the process any further, but that is the right thing to do. So I think, Frank, I think we're going to be closing up now, and I say to one and all, thank you very much for attending this fairly comprehensive webinar. We have a few questions that have popped in. I'm just going to take two of them, because I know we've been together for a while, and I think that a couple of these are worth mentioning. And I'm just going to get to the first one right now. I don't understand why I can't ask about citizenship or national origin when people need authorization to work in the U.S. Don't I have to ask about candidates' immigration status? It's a good question. Applicants are protected from discrimination based on their national origin. We talked about that, obviously, during the presentation. Now, before the offer, the only discussion about citizenship status that may lawfully occur is whether the applicant is currently eligible to work in the U.S. And this question, again, should be asked of all candidates. Following the offer stage, the successful applicant will be required, and I hope all the folks out there are doing it, to submit documentation of eligibility to satisfy Form I-9 requirements. We can do a whole webinar on Form I-9, and we may be doing that down the road, but that's really kind of your best way to do this. Now, another one, this will be our final question. What selection criteria should I use? First and foremost, you want to use the standard selected criteria in your interviews. What I mean by that is that you should use the same criteria to judge each candidate. This will help keep your selection process fair, objective, and effective. Don't deviate. Make sure everybody has the same questions. Draft your selection criteria while considering the nature of the job you're interviewing for, so the criteria are relevant to the duties of the position in question. Again, going back to the job description and requirements, draw on performance factors that candidates can demonstrate during the selection procedure, like relevant training, education, and experience, as well as presentation during the interview. So that wraps it up. We've had time for 2 questions. Thank you so much for joining us today, and stay tuned for new webinars.